sea called the Caribbean Sea, and I have been talking about it. The Caribbean Sea is not the Atlantic Ocean, although it is connected to the Atlantic Ocean. There is the Atlantic Ocean out here. And then there are a series of islands in a curve, which like intervene. And they create two bodies of water. One made Sarasota. It's called the Gulf of Mexico, right? And New Orleans. And as you can see, the westernmost island, Cuba, almost touches Mexico, the coast of North America. So to the north of that lies the Gulf of Mexico. But south of it, enclosed by this curve of islands, its southern boundary being South America, its western boundary being Central America and Cancun. Is something called the Caribbean Sea, and it looks different. If in Cuba you're on the Atlantic side, it's darker and wilder. And if you're on the Caribbean side, just go a few miles above it. If you're on the Caribbean side, it's sort of blue, green, and color. I mean, you can see the contrast. It's overwhelming. I didn't believe it until I was standing there like Columbus, looking at the difference. And we have been focusing on this Caribbean. The Caribbean islands are divided into what we call the Big Islands. The Big Islands are Cuba, that's the biggest of them all, about the size of the lower peninsula of Michigan. And then there is Hispaniola, which contains two countries, French-speaking Haiti, or Creole-speaking Haiti, and Spanish-speaking Dominican Republic. At one time it was controlled entirely by Spain. Its name, the whole island's name, means Little Spain, Hispaniola. And then next to it is something that belongs to the United States of America, seized in 1898. It's called Puerto Rico, otherwise known as Puerto Rico. All right, so right there. And then south of Cuba, there is an island much smaller than Cuba and Hispaniola, but bigger than Puerto Rico, which is called Jamaica. You have the four big islands. And north of Cuba, there is a collection of islands with shallow harbors, very good for pirates, in case you're planning on being a pirate, which we call the Bahamas, which lie right off the coast of East Florida. And that's called the Greater Antilles. And then, to the east of it, is this collection of itsy-bitsies, all right? Itsy-bitsy islands. There are dozens of them, some bigger and some smaller. And they go all the way down to the coast of South America, to what today is the political entity called Venezuela. And they're called the Lesser Antilles. And they're divided into two groups, which we'll see the names. The Leeward Islands and the Windward Islands. The winds come out of the east. So the islands that sort of take the wind coming out of the east are called windward. And those on the curve that aren't in that position are called leeward. And this barrier between the Atlantic outside here and the water within helps to create what we call the Caribbean Sea. Now, in order to understand the Caribbean, you can talk about the water, you can talk about the fish, you can talk about the mountains. Many of the islands are volcanic. They are the tips of mountains that are start way down in the sea, and only the tip, all right? The top of it is to be seen above the water. But we're interested in the people and what they're doing. Now, these people are very well known to the United States of America. Every Christmas, I can identify at least 2,000 people in the Birmingham area who pick themselves up and go down to either Fort Lauderdale or Miami. They're waiting for them. Are these ships? I mean, can you call them a ship? They're floating skyscrapers. You remember cruise ships that used to have these clean lines, and then the funnels came out like, no. Now when you look at them, they look like wedding cakes. Am I on floor 86? Am I on floor 93? Where am I? They're not elegant looking. They're top heavy. I call them the SUVs of the world. I think they're hideous. I can't. I love the old. You showed me the old Titanic. I mean, I thought that was elegant. The lines were absolutely elegant. Or the old Queen Mary, the line really elegant. This is just to maximize the number of people that you could take. And so, I mean, you have 5,000 people on the ship. You have a city. You have the population of one of these little islands. And it's a floating skyscraper. Is it comfortable? Of course it's comfortable. Hopefully you have an outside porthole or window or something like that, and you can see things going on. Now, the number of these ships now floating through the Caribbean, can you count? I am surprised that there's any room for the water. Do you understand? If you think of the Caribbean as a bathtub, and these as little ships that you stick into the bathtub, I mean, where is the room for the water? And they're all heading for these islands. And then every day, or almost every day, there's a little island you stop. And then you get off. And there they are, the people of the island. They're almost universally black. They're African. And we call them West Indian, but I mean, they're African. And they're there, and they're selling things, or they're begging, or they're transporting you, or they're doing something for you. They are the servant class of the West Indies. And out of the boats, they pour out thousands of people. Are most of the tourists on the boats interested in the political parties on Barbados? I mean, I haven't met one person. I mean, do you know anybody that asks about the political parties on Barbados, where it's called shopping? And of course, a lot of people have their favorite islands. Some islands are boring. The shopping isn't very good. There isn't very much to see. There aren't any interesting museums, and all the people look alike anyway. And there's a lot of poverty, which is annoying. We didn't pay on your trip to see poverty. So, I mean, there are millions of Americans. You know how many people take Caribbean cruises now? No. I don't know the exact number. I don't know the exact number of people on Caribbean cruises, but there are millions of North America, not only North Americans. Do you know how many people fly in from Europe? Take these trips, go to these islands. They have become a tourist paradise. All you have to do is spend one winter in Michigan. So these are very well-known islands. People who haven't traveled anywhere in the world, they haven't gone to London, they haven't gone to Paris, they haven't gone to Beijing, they haven't gone to New Delhi, and they certainly haven't gone to Mecca. But they've gotten to St. Martin's or St. Kitts or Martinique or whatever else, and they've been there. And they often go with their family. It's a wonderful way to bring your family together for a holiday. You all go on the boat. And you encounter the natives. You can't help but encounter the natives. There they are. There may be, in the entire West Indies, something like 25 million people most of them African, who have lives of their own, agonies and problems of their own, who are citizens of little itsy-bitsy countries, the names of which most Americans can't even give you. But we know them. We see them. They're standing there. Well, here is a part of the world that's very much a part of American culture, because American culture now involves something called travel. People don't regard travel anymore as a luxury. People tell me it's a necessity. I've got to get away. I've got to get away. Yes. I'm trying to imagine my grandmother saying, I've got to get away. I've got to get away. Of course, got to get away. So now it's not a luxury, this travel. This is a necessity. And in fact, when you make contracts, union contracts, whatever, employee contracts, you have to include the travel, the vacation, because it's not a luxury. It's like health care. It's a necessity, so it's part of our culture. And yet we know less about these places in terms of their people than we do about Afghanistan. We're reading about Afghanistan. We know about Iraq. We don't know anything. I haven't asked people. Who is the Prime Minister of Grenada? What's going on? No. What's going on in Barbados? So I thought I would do this because I really think there needs to be some information. It's a part of the Caribbean which we know. We visit. It isn't some obscure place. It's not central Greenland. Now, these islands were occupied by what we call Native Americans or Amerindians, all right, for thousands and thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived. Did they realize they were in a tourist paradise? I'm not sure. Their lives weren't always easy. The first ones that we know that arrived, that we can identify, are a group of people who have vanished. Totally and completely. They're called the Arawaks. And they were people who engaged in some kind of primitive agriculture, also did fishing, and engaged in feuding and war among themselves. But they were fairly peaceful people. And until about the 14th century, their lives were comparatively placid. And then about 200 years before the Europeans arrived, before the whites arrived, all hell broke loose. It had nothing to do with Europeans. Right? They weren't around. I mean, we're generally blamed for everything, but in this case, we didn't do it. What arrived was another group of Native Americans or Amerindians. They were to give their name to the sea. They're called the Caribs. And the Carib or Carib people came from South America. The Arawaks may have come also from South America, and what they did was they simply skipped their way up the islands until they reached Cuba. This group also came from the northern coast of South America, and they were island hopping, and they were very warlike. They ate their enemies. And I mentioned this once before. The word cannibal comes from the word cannibal. That's a Carib, do you understand? They ate their enemies. And, you know, one of the reasons to oppose Weight Watching is that if you're captured, at least you can be delicious. They were fierce, and they dumped themselves on the Arawaks, and they went moving up the islands. In fact, Cuba, about the time that Christopher Columbus landed or came to the Bahamas in 1492. Now, at the time the Europeans arrived, the Arawaks had been driven out of most of the Lesser Antilles, the little islands. The Arawaks remained besieged in places like Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Cuba. But the little islands, the Martiniques, the Guadeloupe, the St. Lucia, the Trinidad, whatever it was, that was now in the hands of the Caribs. You can look at Caribs if you want to. They still survive, although most of them were destroyed or killed by the Europeans. There is an island that most tourists do not go to because it's mountainous and is not geared to tourism yet. It's working on it. It's called Dominica. It lies between two French islands. One is called Martinique, and the other one called Guadeloupe. They're right up here. And right in the middle, between them, is an island that was owned by England, not by France. All right? In fact, it wasn't settled for a long time. Most of these islands weren't settled for a very simple reason. If you landed, you could be eaten. No. Even the Europeans were terrified. They were overwhelming. Had Caribs been in Michigan, we most likely wouldn't have had Detroit. One small group survives on Dominica. There's like a Carib reservation that is there. Their culture obviously has changed. They're much more benign, and you can do shopping safely. But they were fierce, and they determined the difference between the stories of the Greater Antilles and the Lesser Antilles. All you could do to a Carib, you couldn't enslave a Carib. All you could do was capture him and kill him. And in fact, when the Spanish first came to these islands, they settled down first in Hispaniola, then in Cuba, then in Jamaica, and then in Puerto Rico. The man who took the Spaniards to Puerto Rico is Ponce de Leon. He's the one who ended up in, finding Florida, all right, looking for the fountain of youth. Isn't that interesting? Because that's where people go. Looking for the fountain of youth. But they didn't settle these islands. What they would do is raid them. And the Carib women were more docile. And they would take them and they would enslave them. And the children. They would kill the man. And in most of these islands, the Carib population was eliminated through Spanish raids. But there were still enough Caribs around that they didn't want to settle there. And they didn't. And that's why these islands aren't Spanish. Right? They're not Spanish islands. That's why this story that I'm doing today, I'm now turning to the part of the Caribbean that isn't Spanish. It's British, Dutch, French. Well, the Spanish came, and in fact these islands were officially part of Spain. Spain laid claim to the entire Western Hemisphere. And it had a certificate given to it by the Pope, which said, that it owned the entire Western Hemisphere, and it wanted no other country to come in. But of course it had competitors in Western Europe. Western Europe, which was the place of the new exploration of the seas, Western Europe had rising nations other than Spain. Spain had a basic problem, which its enemies took advantage of. The Spaniards had fought the Muslims for so long, they built a warrior culture. And in Spain, the only work that was respectable was being a warrior. It was called an hidalgo. Spaniards did not like to go into business. They thought it was cheap, demeaning. So they never built a middle class. Their middle class were Jews, whom they expelled in 1490. So the only way that Spain could be a great power was that she would be able to have access to wealth, which she did not manufacture. Well, she was lucky. Columbus lands, right, and then the Spanish ships come over, and the next thing they find is gold and silver in overwhelming amounts in both Mexico and Peru. The Spanish treasury for 2 centuries is not supported by the work of their people. The Spanish treasury for 2 centuries is supported by the gold and the silver that comes from Mexico and Peru. That's why those ships were so important that crossed over from Mexico. It was brought to Havana. And then from Havana, that's why Havana became important, the gold and the silver were shipped. There were 2 great fleets every year that brought it to Spain. And the second from Peru made its way to Cartagena. Cartagena is in Colombia on the Caribbean. It's a port right next to Venezuela. And from Cartagena, the second one went out through the passage between Cuba and Hispaniola and Haiti, out into the sea and heading for Spain. Without that fleet, the great Spanish kingdom, the most powerful nation in Europe in the 16th century, would not have been able to function. But now you can see the opening to all the movies. It's called Pirates. So, if you were English or French or Dutch, don't have to worry about the Portuguese. They were competitors of the Spaniards. But in 1580, Spain invaded Portugal and took it. And actually, for a period of 60 years, the Portuguese Empire was assumed, controlled by Spain. The king of Spain became the king of Portugal. The entire peninsula, Aragon, Castile, and Portugal were united under one king. So, if you were English, or French, or Dutch, or whatever, and you had the guts, and you knew how to stand on a rope, what do they do in the movies? Then what you become is a pirate. Now, obviously, what you call yourself is different. If you're Spanish, they are pirates, because they're stealing your gold. If you're English, you're a patriot. Because the English are the enemy of Spain. Do you understand? Sir Francis Drake, was he a pirate? No! Did he attack the Spanish fleet? He took, by the way, a year's revenue. A year's revenue. So the way to get rich quick was to go to the Caribbean. Do you understand? Wait for the fleet and then what? Give it to him. And did Queen Elizabeth think he was a pirate? No. She thought he was a patriot. By that time, England was the enemy of Spain, not only because there was a different nationality competing with the Spaniards and wanting to get their foot into the New World, but also because England had become Protestant. And Protestants at that time hated Catholics, and Catholics hated Protestants, and the whole thing. So now the English pirates arrive, and so now they come here. They're all over the place. And they're followed by French pirates. The French also had their thing with the Spaniards. The French in the 16th century are divided religiously. There's a very large Protestant population called the Huguenots who And in fact, the French are competitors with the Spaniards, and now French pirates arrive. Now, they're pirates only from the Spanish point of view. From the French point of view, they are patriots. And now they're all over the place. In the 16th century, starting in the 1530s, it's only 40 years after Columbus, the English and French pirates are there in the Caribbean, and being there, they need bases, right? I mean, you gotta stop by refueling, you gotta get food, whatever else it is, fish, I don't know. Now, the islands that were not occupied, which could serve as bases for these pirates, were the little islands with the Caribs on them. Now, the southern ones, Grenada, today the Caribs didn't call them Grenada, St. Vincent, Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, those southern islands were inhabited by so many Caribs that the British and the French didn't want to touch them, even the pirates, even Errol Flynn looked at land. So they tended to land on what we call the northern part, of that thing. So they established bases. They're little islands that you go to, tourist love. St. Kitts, St. Martin's, right? Did not have resorts then. Caribs, okay. St. Kitts, St. Martin's, Nevis, all these places, and they stop there, and they refuel themselves, and they use that as the base, and the Spaniards aren't on the island, and the fleets are what? Going by, they're waiting for the fleet to leave Havana Harbor or Cartagena Harbor, and then they pounce, and then there are other ships, also containing wealth, that go by from time to time. It was a major, major problem. And Spain complained on a regular basis to the French and the English. And the answer of the English and French government was, we know nothing about them. Who? What? It's like intelligence agents. They are, tell us about your intelligence agent. No, who? What? We don't have any spies. We don't have any spies. Who? Nobody. So they wouldn't own up to it, and it was a source of great provocation. Because for Spain, this was her lifeline. Without it, she had no money to carry out her wars, to run her government, to build the palaces, to run anything. So the English and French arrived, and they set up their bases on what we call the eastern end of the Caribbean, on the little islands that are there. But somebody has to come to change the picture entirely. Because they were simply like little bees stinging the Spaniards. They didn't threaten the Spanish control of the Caribbean. They came out of their lairs from time to time. The people who changed the picture were an extraordinary people. They're one of the extraordinary phenomena in political history. Many of them came to Michigan. They're called the Dutch. At the end of the 16th century, Holland was under the control of Spain. The Dutch had become Protestant. Their rulers were Catholic. And in fact, their Catholic rulers persecuted. So they rose up in a rebellion. Now, the Dutch are an interesting people. They are the only people in the history of humanity who manufactured their own country. They lived, you understand? They built dikes and they rescued the land. There was no land. Half of Holland is land that was what? Created by human intervention. They built the dikes and they drained the water, right? And then all of a sudden you've got land. Where Amsterdam is today was underwater. Half of Holland was underwater. Extraordinary people. The only people I know in the history of humanity who made their own country. It's human intervention. they defeated the Spanish. One of the ways they defeated the Spanish was they knew how to do that. As the Spanish army is advancing to crush the Dutch, they opened up the dikes and let the water flood the place. They drowned the enemy. And then they what? Pushed the water back. By 1590, although Spain would not recognize their independence, they had become independent. They hated the Spanish. In fact, they so hated the Spanish, who had just expelled the Jews. The Dutch were the first people to grant religious freedom to the Jews in Western Europe. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the philosopher Spinoza. All right. So they came to Holland. And the other thing about the Dutch was, and they still are, hard workers. And it was in the Netherlands, in Holland, that they began already at the end of the 16th century, a revolution which was the continuation of what had taken place in northern Italy. It's called the money economy. And Amsterdam has now become the leading center of the new money economy. The Dutch were interested in trade and commerce. They lived on the sea, they made ships. And they hated the Spanish. So now comes revenge. In 1620, there arrives in the Caribbean not a bunch of pirates. There arrives a Dutch fleet to take over the Caribbean from the Spanish fleet. And between 1620 and 1650, they wreak absolute havoc in the Spanish Empire. They take Brazil, and then having taken Brazil, they grab a series of islands just north of Venezuela that all tourists go to. Curacao, Aruba. They need a base of operations in the Caribbean for their fleet, and Curacao has a magnificent harbor. They take it, they now have a base for their fleet, and their purpose now is to rule the Caribbean. And in fact, their aim is essentially to seize the islands. They have already gone to the Portuguese East Indies, what today we call Indonesia, the Spice Islands, which at that time was under the control of Spain. And they took it all. And they changed the Portuguese East Indies into the Dutch East Indies, which still existed when we were, some of us, were children. So there's amazing people. I mean, you can't even find Holland on the map. On a world map, it is so small, you can't even see it. And yet, at the beginning of the 17th century, this little itsy-bitsy nation went out to become one of the most powerful nations in the world. A burgeoning economy, a huge fleet, both military and merchant. And now the Dutch struck terror. Terror, I mean, how are they ever going to get to go? If the Dutch fleet is going to be in the Caribbean, I mean, I'm talking about a bunch of pirates. If the Dutch fleet is going to be in the Caribbean, what are they going to do? And now they have a base. Curacao and Aruba, not tourist destinations. That wasn't the purpose of taking the islands. One of the things they needed was salt. And what they did, and they made money on it because they sold salt also to French and British pirates. Salt is essential. They keep telling you it's not good for you. You don't have it. You don't have enough, you're going to die. So they actually seized St. Martin's. Some French pirates had already been on, they just took it. And a little island near St. Martin's, which I'm not sure is very touristy, St. Eustatius which is right there, and they turned them into a salt emporium. So any ship, do you understand, could come by, pick up the salt. They were just taking control of the Caribbean. Had they been able to stay there, they may have taken Cuba or Haiti. Do you understand the whole shebang? It was the Dutch that basically defeated the Spanish. They brought there at Little Hollow, defeated Spain. And the Spanish were not able again to establish control in the Caribbean. In fact, the Dutch were so arrogant that they forced the Spaniards to trade with them, so that Spanish colonies and cities along the Caribbean were brought their supplies by the Dutch, and they paid high prices for it. The Dutch changed the Caribbean. The Spanish now are on the run. Yes, they're in Cuba, and yes, they have most of Hispaniola, and yes, they have Puerto Rico, but they don't control the water. Well, why isn't the whole place Dutch? There are a few places that are Dutch. Curacao is still part, still belongs to Holland. Aruba still belongs to Holland. Got that. But there isn't much else. And there's half of St. Martin's that is still Dutch. And now they've forgotten about the salt. It's all tourists. But there. Well, the answer is, and this is the beginning of modern times. Up until that time, people fought wars in terms of religion. If you were Protestant, you allied yourself with other Protestants, and you fought Catholics. But by the middle of the 17th century, things were changing. The new money economy was emerging, and now people were interested not so much in missionaries as in money. And there was a country that was rising. It was also Protestant. And it saw the Dutch as their chief rival. They also were shipbuilding people, very ambitious. They're named the English. Now, the English had helped the Dutch against the Spanish. Protestant with Protestant against the Catholics. But now, in the middle of the 17th century, it is England that turns against Holland. And the man who does it is supposed to be one of the most religious Protestants around. He had cut off the head of the English king. His name was Oliver Cromwell. It's the 1650s. And he now brings an English fleet into the Caribbean. And the idea is to defeat not the Spanish. The Spanish have been defeated. The point is, the Caribbean belongs to us, not to the Dutch. Now you know you're in modern times, because in modern times wars aren't generally wars of religion, although quite frankly, this war of terrorism is the revival of something that goes back to the Middle Ages. But that wasn't true in World War II, and that wasn't true in World War I, or whatever else it is. Two Protestant nations are now fighting. The English sweep in. And the first thing that Cromwell does is to establish a base. There's a little island south of Cuba. The fleet lands in Jamaica. And they take Jamaica. Now, Jamaica was a Spanish island. There were Spanish settlers there. Well, Jamaica is now British. It's now English. It's now the base of operations for the English in the Caribbean, just as Curacao is for the Dutch. The Spanish are irrelevant. Now, that war is to go on with the Dutch for 20 years. The result is that the Spanish and Portuguese recover Brazil. And the other thing is that the English are now motivated to get rid of the Dutch everywhere in the Western Hemisphere. A little north of the Caribbean islands, the West Indies, is a little nothing place. Much less important than the Caribbean. I'll give you its name. New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam has a governor. His name is Peter Stuyvesant. He's Dutch. The whole town is a little nothing town up there on a little island. The real estate is worthless. And Curacao is worth something. In New Amsterdam, it isn't worth very much. It's not going anywhere. And, in fact, Peter Stuyvesant later on is to move from New Amsterdam to a bigger assignment. He becomes the governor of Curacao. People don't know that because why would you, New York? New York, that's the best assignment. Nothing, it's dumb. They move him from New Amsterdam to Curacao because for the Dutch, the Caribbean is the place. And so, let's go a little bit north. They give it to New Amsterdam, and New Amsterdam is changed into New York. It becomes an English colony. It's a kind of incidental consequence of the war in the Caribbean. So now the English arrive. Up until that time, there had been only Spanish settlers on whatever islands there were. But now there arrived some Dutch settlers and some English settlers. And let me tell you about an island that the English take, which is to be the model for them. I don't know whether you've ever been there. I haven't been. Someday I'd like to go there because of its history. Maybe I'll like the shopping. It's called Barbados. And Barbados is interesting. Barbados is very difficult to take. It's what we call a windward island. And what people will do is they come here and they sail down, and in order to get to Barbados, you're turning east, you have to go against the what? The wind coming this way, so it's very hard for a foreign conqueror to get, to get to the island. And so Barbados was not easy to take. Small island, itsy-bitsy. The English take it. Living on the island were Caribs. Got rid of them. And now, in 1640, the English bring settlers to the island. And they settle down, and what do they grow? They grow a weed that can grow almost anywhere that people have now fallen in love with. It's called tobacco. It's a new weed, then very popular, and the number of people using the weed was increasing, and so they plant these weeds on Barbados, and it does okay. Where is the labor coming from? Well, the labor is coming from England. And England was now suffering from overpopulation. And they didn't know what to do with the excess population, so they decided to ship them out. And the way they were shipped out is something called an indentured servant. You promise for 5 years to work for somebody, really as a slave. And then after 5 years, you are free, and your transportation is paid for, and you most likely will have access to some kind of land in Europe. But for 5 years, you have to work as a slave. Many of the English colonies in America were settled. So they brought out English indentured servants. This was the poverty-stricken excess population of London, who knows what. They get on the boat, they land in Barbados, and they're put to growing tobacco. But a problem arises from the beginning. European diseases killed off a lot of the Amerindian population, namely smallpox and syphilis. But now, this is the tropics. Today, you're in the air-conditioned ship. You get out of the air-conditioned ship, you go into the air-conditioned taxi. In the air-conditioned taxi, you go to the air-conditioned shop. I mean, the whole thing. Then you got a clinic with inoculations. I mean, nobody's dying from yellow fever. Do you understand? On a trip, they look at Rabbi. Maybe you can get sick on the boat from the food, but generally speaking, you're not destroyed by the diseases. Almost all the Englishmen who came out to work as indentured servants died. That's why they decided that maybe they should grow the tobacco in Virginia. Because you couldn't bring indentured servants down here who were European. They simply died out. And in fact, the second best choice was after Barbados was Virginia. So actually the tobacco, the English tobacco industry moved from Barbados to Virginia. It's hard for us to imagine that we're second fiddle and the West Indies is first fiddle, right? But that's what it was. Certainly in the 17th century, we were second fiddle, and that was first fiddle. And now they've got to find substitute labor. They've got to find somebody who can survive in the tropics. Well, it's very clear. Africans. So what we need to do is to bring over Africans. And so, the English now engage in the famous slave trade. And after they make peace with the Dutch are also part of the slave trade. The two most important slavers are the English and the Dutch. And they bring Africans, and they bring them in boatloads to the islands. In fact, by the beginning of the 18th century, already the overwhelming majority of the population on these little islands is African, as it is in Cuba, as it is in Hispaniola, whatever it be. That's the story of the Caribbean. And having brought over the African slaves, they now make a very important change. Very important change. I was reading in a book that in 1920, every Englishman consumed 110 pounds of sugar a year. Have you ever watched the English, the theater? They used to buy boxes. They would buy boxes of candy. They loved it. Their teeth used to rot. But they would sit there and they would just pop little chocolates. Chocolate was, they loved sweets. Something that happened in the 17th century was that Western Europeans developed an addiction to sugar. They couldn't get enough of it. And I understand it. So sugar is the perfect thing to plant here. They discover it's better than tobacco. That wheat can grow almost anywhere. Send it off to Virginia. We're going to start with sugar. You can't grow sugar in Virginia. It's too cold. You can't grow it up in the English colonies of North America. It's too cold. You can grow it down here. And so in the 17th century, they shifted on Barbados. They shifted from tobacco to sugar. And sugar, of course, is labor intensive. You ever see those sugars? Stuck up a couple of them down. The whole process is very interesting. You got to cut it down, and then you have to boil it to extract what we call the sugar part. Then there's this leftover stuff that's called molasses. It's hard work, and the Africans were perfect. They brought them to Barbados, and they lived. They didn't die out like the English indentured servants that they had brought. And So now it was a success. Barbados at the end of the 17th century was regarded as the richest part of the English Empire. That little island. And in fact, it was overpopulated. By 1680, there were 13,000 people living on this little island. It was more densely populated than England or southeastern England. They were making money hand over fist. It was the gold of the Caribbean for them. And once the experiment had worked in Barbados, it shifted, it moved. The Spanish picked it up, Hispaniola, Cuba, whatever it was. Slaves for sugar, slaves for sugar, slaves for sugar. But the British had started it, the English had started it. And now they had a reason to capture more islands. They had another island, Jamaica. They now created sugar plantations in Jamaica. It took longer, it took almost to the beginning of the 18th century before Jamaica developed what we call this sugar economy. The richest people in England had either invested in or were owners of sugar plantations in the West Indies. And one of the things I read a long time ago, and most likely is true, the Industrial Revolution in England was financed with the money that was made on sugar. The sugar was the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution was the 19th century. Where did the money come to finance it? It came from sugar. So these little islands now are what we call these poverty dumps. The ships look great, but the little islands are in terrible condition, were at one time the richest possessions of the European powers. And in fact, the Dutch picked up the growing of sugar, and the Spanish picked it up, and then the French arrived. They want to join in with the fun. So now comes the land grab. There are only so many islands here, right? Who's going to get the islands? The Spanish can't, because the Spanish have already been defeated. There are only 3 people that can do it, that have the power to do it. They're the English, the French, and the Dutch. So they go and they divvy up the island, and that's why today, you go to one island and they speak English, you go to another island and they speak French, you go to another island and they speak Dutch, because they're all in the land grab. So these pirate bases that have now been de-Caribbean become the sources of enormous wealth. Generally, the great plantation owners in Barbados in the 18th century would have a gorgeous house in Barbados. And the house would be surrounded by hundreds of slaves. And they would certainly have a house in London. And they would sail to, do you understand? To London. Their investments would also be in London, real estate, whatever, and all kinds of things. And in fact, they became part of the financing power of Great Britain. Well, now let me tell you the most interesting thing. In 1775, the English colonies rebelled against the mother country. You may remember it's called the American Revolution. And from our point of view, that's the most important part of the English Empire. The little islands owned by the English over here, so they got Dominica, they got Barbados, they got St. Vincent, they got St. Lucia. You can compare that to New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. Give me a break. Well, as you know, the British were defeating the rebels until there was an intervention. The intervention was by the power that now hated the English fiercely, because the English had taken Canada from them. They were the French. The French now offered their assistance to the Americans. Benjamin Franklin went to Paris. And now what happens in 1779 is a French fleet arrives off the coast of America. The English fleet isn't confronted by a few American ships, nothing. John Paul Jones, nothing. They're now confronted by the French fleet. Why couldn't Cornwallis be evacuated from Yorktown? The Americans? No. He couldn't be evacuated from Yorktown because the French fleet blocked the harbor. And when he surrendered at Yorktown, people said, well, that was the defeat. Well, I don't think people understand why 2 years later, the United States got its independence. Let me try to explain. For 2 years, they haggled. The British and the Americans and the French, because the French were part of this thing. What had happened during the Revolutionary War, and nobody tells us, or they may have told us, but we didn't remember because it didn't seem important, was that the French fleet captured the British islands in the West Indies. So when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the French said to the British, if you want your West Indian islands back, you will grant independence to the Americans. Today, somebody said, you understand? If you want Barbados back, give us New York. But I do want to tell you, this is the end of the 18th century in the British mind. Those sugar islands were more valuable than all the colonies along the shore of North. And in fact, the deal was made. The French evacuated the islands that they had seized from the English, the sugar islands, and the United States of America became independent. So our history is intimately connected with these islands. The choice made by England was the sugar islands are more important to us than all the colonies along the coast in North America. So, that's the heyday of the Caribbean. Now, it's the heyday for the whites in the Caribbean. So now, let me just talk about society. At the top are the what? The whites. They're either English, Dutch, or French. They got gorgeous houses, good taste, I don't know. Their life is wonderful. After I saw Gone with the Wind, did I want a plantation? It's not bad, right? But for the overwhelming majority of the people who were there, who were African, who had been imported, life was below terrible. People describing slavery and the history of slavery regard this as one of the worst. Because in Europe, there was a form of slavery called serfdom. But you at least were protected by certain rights. You couldn't do certain things to your slaves, do you understand? There was no constraint. Slaves were regarded in the islands as your property to be done with as you will. If you want to kill them, you can what? Kill them. If you want to abuse them, you can abuse them. Now that slavery was not allowed in medieval Europe. But it was for African slaves in the Indies. Often they were put together in gangs, separated from their families, and they functioned in the field in gangs. They worked 6 days a week from 5 o'clock in the morning until sundown, every day. And if they resisted work, I mean, it was a concentration camp. They were beaten and killed. So you can imagine the levels of resentment that existed in the sugar economy. I mean, that's why the slave rebellions in the West Indies sometimes were the most terrible, because the hatred and resentment was overwhelming. There was another group of people. It's a confusing word. In Cuba, the word which is used for the mixture of black and white is mulatto. But in the English islands, the Dutch islands, the word that is used is Creole. That's confusing because in Spanish domains, Creoles are whites who are natives of the area, like the Creoles in New Orleans, all right? But the word Creole, as it evolved in the Indies here, especially in the English Indies and the Dutch West Indies, meant the mulatto. And they existed as a class of people between the whites and the blacks. Some of them were freed, and some of them were in business of their own. And they saw themselves as far superior to the blacks, and they hated the blacks. The whites despised them, and they in turn, well, despised the blacks, creating this very interesting social fabric in the West Indies. Whites, in the middle the mulatto Creoles, and at the bottom the blacks themselves. But in the end, it made no difference, because a force arose in England that was going to destroy the plantation culture. In the 19th century, England was industrialized. And once it was industrialized, it turned to manufacturing. And once it turned to manufacturing, the most efficient form of labor for it was not slavery, it was free labor, which you hire, and when you don't need it, you fire. And there arose a force in England, led by a man called William Wilberforce. And he was a Methodist. It was the Methodists in England that were behind what we call the abolition movement. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And there were all these novels and pamphlets and books written against African slavery. So intense was the pressure that in 1833, the Parliament of Great Britain abolished slavery in England and all its colonies. So now the word gets to Barbados, and this whole economy rests on slaves. So now they're liberated. And actually, what happens once they're liberated is the whole plantation system collapses. The slaves don't want to work anymore for what? These masters. I mean, they don't want to negotiate contracts. They just drift off. How do they survive? Well, they go into subsistence agriculture. They grab little bits of land. You see that all over the island. Little itsy pieces of subsistence agriculture. They grab them, a little bit like the American South. The plantation system collapses. And that is aggravated by something else. In the middle of the 19th century, the price of sugar falls. One of the reasons is, if you can grow sugar in the West Indies, you can grow sugar in the East Indies. You can grow it anywhere it is what? It's warm. So now sugar is being grown everywhere, and so the West Indies, which at one time was the center of what we call the sugar empire, now has the liberation of the slaves, the fall of the price, and the islands sink into poverty, because one of the consequences is that the white people leave. They don't have much of a problem, because during the time that they were in charge of the plantations, they put a lot of money in London banks. So they just go to their house what? They go out of their houses. The whites go, and the islands are now left all black or Creole or mulatto. And the mulattoes don't like the blacks, and the blacks don't like the mulattoes. regrets having given up New York for Barbados. And the question by the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century is the question that I wish to address to you now. So what's going to happen to this place? I mean, that was the big question. The British would have liked to simply wash their hands of the islands. But it was an expense. They had to send soldiers there. They weren't making any money. There were no important white settlers who lived there. And the sugar economy had collapsed. So, the West Indies turned into not simply a center of slavery. It moved from a center of African slavery into a major center of African poverty. And in fact, to some degree, that is where it still remains. However, things are happening in these islands that are making a difference. It's a very interesting development in the history of the world. The industry is developing, which we in Detroit have not yet learned to cultivate. So I want to talk about that. In 5 minutes, please come back. Thank you. It's hard for us to imagine or to see that these islands in the 18th century were among the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world. They were the source of the money that would ultimately fuel the Industrial Revolution that took place in England. And it was the Industrial Revolution, ironically, that would bring down slavery. But everything came tumbling down in the middle of the 19th century with the abolition of slavery. England became this force in the world, used its fleet to end the slave trade. They sent their ships all over the world to end the slave trade. So meanwhile, these islands, I mean, the British government is sitting around saying, who needs it? We want New York Bank. I mean, this is a dump. I mean, it was an expense. There was no revenue for England of any significance anymore. It was just a cost. The only reason you hang on to them is for imperial glory. And Britain had enough imperial glory with India. They didn't need these little itsy-bitsy islands for imperial glory. So, what do you do with them? Can you just pull out? You can't just pull out. I mean, after all, your prestige is at stake. So you have to have a governor, and the governor has to have a staff. The governor is always what? White. Would you have a black governor? Right. The staff, is it black? It's white. And when they come to live on the islands, do they live in the black neighborhood? They live in a little separate little section of the government house and the whole thing. And in fact, if you're a tourist, you can go see the buildings they built there. For the staff, for the governor and the staff and the head of the police and whatever else it is, and they're all white, and they're all complaining. These people are ignorant. These people are stupid. These people. They theoretically are not slaves, but the income level at which they live is like the income level of slavery. So let me try to describe the culture that now emerges in the islands. You bump into it when you're there shopping. The culture is a culture of poverty. Do you understand? It's unrelieved poverty. I'm not talking about right now, after the big ships come. I'm talking about at the end of the 19th century, there were no tourist ships. It was what? Unrelieved poverty. The white upper class had fled. Africa in the way they speak English. I mean, it's this musical and Harry Belafonte. It's that we call it West Indian speech. It's English. It's certainly more musical than Michigan English, because Michigan English is one long monotone. This Belafonte goes up, that's more. But it's pidgin, and there's pidgin French in Haiti, isn't that right? We talked about that when I talked about Haiti. So they speak this pidgin, and so tourists can speak English. It's their language. They understand each other. It's our fault. There's this huge dichotomy. The dichotomy is generally between the government officials who come out from England or Holland or wherever they're coming, you understand, and the African populations that are there. The dichotomy is huge. There is available menial work. There's always menial work available, for which you're paid almost nothing. Something has to be cleaned. Something has to be scrubbed. Something has to be fixed. Somebody has to be carried. Somebody has to be moved. Oh, yeah, go. So the work that was available was menial work. Generally, how most people survived was they found themselves a little piece of land and they grew food. And they made their own clothes. It's called subsistence living. Now, they couldn't have done this in Russia because they all would have frozen to death. Poverty is easier in the tropics. You can make yourself a little what? Take a few boards, make yourself a little hut. Do that in St. Petersburg. You know, you make yourself a little hut, you understand? And you can survive, right? In the tropics, you can survive. Poverty in the tropics is, can you say easier? You can survive. One of the mainstays of their life, because when their power needed some access to some kind of power, was religion. They were overwhelmingly religious. They had been converted on the whole to either Protestantism or Roman Catholicism. On the French islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe, they're into Roman Catholic. In Barbados and whatever, they're into Protestant. But the established religions don't sing to their hearts. So there are two other religions that enter into their lives. One is their African religion. It certainly survived in Haiti, it survives in Cuba, and it survives in Brazil, whatever else it is. It's all mixed together with Christianity. And in fact, African gods become Christian saints, whatever. The rituals, however, are African. Do the people doing them know the sociology of what they're doing? The answer is no. If you ask them, are you Christian? What are you? Christian, you're a Christian. But they've got all these African gods that they're working with. The other influence, in particular, were fundamentalist Protestant missionaries. By the end of the 19th century, it was hard to find mainline Protestant missionaries. They preferred to get PhDs at universities. But the people who are willing to go out to work with the natives were these fundamentalists, and they would show up, and they would provide a support community for many of these people. They still do. They go all over Latin America, and they convert people. And then, of course, part of it were the Creoles. The Creoles are these mulattoes. If there's any upper class left, other than what we call the staff from England, the white staff that arrives from England or Holland or whatever to manage the place, it's the Creoles. If there are businesses, they run the little shops, the little store. They're the ones who sell to the blacks. They look down on them. Just as the whites look down on them, they look down on the blacks, and that's the society. From our perspective, they most likely are fairly poor. In some cases, they make it. And the tension between the two, the blacks and the Creoles, is great, just as in French Haiti. So how do they cope with all plenty of bananas around the world. And now we find reasons for eating them in the cast. I don't know. I like them. But bananas now become the big thing, right? From Africa, they're transported to Central America, and they're growing them in Central America. You grow them in Central America, you grow them in Dominica. You can grow them on St. Vincent. You can grow them on these islands that are perfect for bananas. So they bring bananas in. Well, that's jobs, right? It's menial work. I mean, you're theoretically liberated, but at least you've got what? Work on these banana plantations. And in fact, bananas now arrive. And in fact, if you go to some of the islands that are not heavily touristed, you'll find bananas. Bananas have replaced there's still some sugar. There's no tobacco. But now you've got bananas, and that's very big. I still remember the power of bananas when communism fell in Russia. The first thing that appeared on the streets was private kiosks. And what they sold for $1 each was a banana. The power to buy a banana meant that you were in the upper class, as opposed to the lower class. So I always call it the power of the banana. And so that was so there. Anyway, the second way to cope is leave. I mean, the West Indians have been emigrating from their islands for decades. Why would they stay? So if you go to London, places what? It's loaded with West Indians. If you go to Montreal, they got earmuffs. Is that a good choice? No. They're all over the place. They're emigrating. You can hear these accents all over the place. The Caribbean accents. Not simply from the Spanish islands, but primarily from what we call the English and the Dutch and the French islands. One of the ways they coped, although it didn't do very much good, that there were among many of the blacks activists who said, we're sick and tired of doing this menial work and getting paid absolutely nothing. So they organized unions. In fact, most of the political leadership in the Caribbean, in the English, Dutch, and French islands, most of the political leadership came from blacks who were union leaders. And they got that idea, obviously, from Europe and from the States. The problem was that the people they were striking against didn't have a lot of resources to share with them, but at least it gave them some sense of what? We're organizing, we're marching, we're demonstrating, we're not sitting by passively. It was a whole new feeling. And out of the unions came political parties. The attitude of the English toward these people and the Dutch was the following. Well, we don't want to be here anymore. You're lucky we're staying, keeping the port open. So don't ask us for representation. You understand? We'll run with like that. You're lucky, aren't you? Don't ask us for representation. You don't want a legislature. We'll have an advisory council and we'll pick whatever tame people we can find to advise us who will agree with us at the end. We don't want democracy. What good is it? You're lucky to have us and what? Shut up. So basically they were run in authoritarian fashions. The white staff would arrive and they would run the island. But now with the organization of unions already at the beginning of the 20th century, the union people began to organize political parties, and now they began to demand from the government. There were those people that don't demand too loud, they leave. And they'll take whatever subsidies we have with them. But they began to demand some kind of participation, do you understand, in the government, representation. Thank you. All the parties, since they came out of unions, were sort of on the left. They were on the left because they weren't bothered. of blacks who simply, either they had left slavery on their own, or they just withdrew from control under the central government. And they organized their own villages up in the hillside. The name given to these blacks is, the French word is marron, and in English it's called the Maroons. They're called M-A-R-O-O-N-S. They are basically people of slave origin who simply seceded from the established society, went off on their own, and basically lived in subsistence agriculture, but at least they weren't bothered by the central government. And of course, religion. One of the things that happened in the islands, of course, was the creation of new religions that fit the needs of the blacks. By the beginning of the 20th century, there is black nationalism, directed not only toward the few whites that are around, but also toward the Creoles. And the most famous of all the religions that comes out of the non-Spanish Caribbean is a group of people called the Rastafarians. Ever heard of the Rastafarians? They're an interesting group. They're also in New York, but I mean, they're all over the place. They have this, their hair is always interesting. In fact, some black musicians have taken to Rastafarian costume. They have a very interesting idea. So, close to that of black Muslims. Blacks are the chosen race. And in fact, all blacks should return to Africa, our homeland, and God is black. Who is God? Do you remember Haile Selassie? So liked him. Remember, he got up the League of Nations and announced the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. It was Haile Selassie. And then he was murdered by communist rebels many decades later. Haile Selassie, because this religion was organized in 1930, and Haile Selassie at that time was the king of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia. And Haile Selassie is the incarnation of God. And we put it all together. I mean, for real. I do want to tell you the thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I mean, they're searching, they're trying to grab at something to give them dignity. Here's a religion that gives them dignity. The chosen race, God is black, Rastafarian, R-A-S-T-A-F-A-R-I-A-N-S. And it comes from the title of Haile Selassie. Ras is like Rosh in Rosh Hashanah. It's means head. So they're Rastafarians, and I mention this because it's not the only religion to emerge. There are others. In fact, Garvey, who started black nationalism in Harlem in the 1920s, came out of the West Indies. Many of the people who organized the beginnings of black nationalism in the 1920s came out of this cauldron of discontent and resentment in the West Indies. Well, ultimately what happens is World War II comes. And after World War II, England cannot afford the West Indies. Not only that they can't afford the West Indies, a problem is now arising. It's a problem that England faces. If you are a member of the British Empire, then you are a British subject, and you were entitled as a British subject to move to the British homeland. Now, certainly, for most of the 19th century, very few Indians ever thought of what? Picking themselves up and moving to London. It's inconceivable. How do you get there? Once they got airplanes. And whatever, the people simply pick themselves up and go. So now, if you're living on one of these islands and you're not happy, British subject. So you can just pick yourself up and fly to London. And now London is filling up with West Indians. So now there are people living on the west side in Westminster who notice the change. They are a little disturbed. Is England becoming less English? Do you understand? I mean, acres and acres of West Indians living there in South London. I mean, what's going to happen to this country? And then the Indians and the Pakistanis and whatever, go find an Englishman in England. So the English said, go. We don't, please. We're going to give you your independence. And their response was, don't. No, it's the reverse. Because if we're independent, we won't be able to get to England. We'll have to stay home. We don't want to stay home. And not only that, after World War II, the British had instituted a welfare system. So now, not only wouldn't I be able to get to London, I'll lose my welfare benefits and I'll be independent. Some independent. Don't leave. My kids say to parents, don't. I mean, that's how tragic this thing is. Everywhere else in the world, people are saying, give us our independence, give us our independence. No, don't leave. The British said, we're leaving. But then the people said, no, you can't leave, you can't leave, you can't leave, you can't leave. And their model was the French and the Dutch. The French had lost their first empire. And for the French empire is glory, even if it's expensive. So the French idea was not to give up their islands, which are now integrated into the French welfare system, and also allows anybody on those islands to move to France. And in fact, if you go to Paris, it's loaded with French West Indians from Martinique and Guadeloupe. They're all over the place. The French turned the islands into part of France, the way they did Algeria. Since Algeria was part of France, any Algerian could move to France. Now, there were some French who said, don't do this. But the French had. And Martinique and Guadeloupe are in what's called the French welfare system. So if you take a survey of Martinique today and you say to the Martinique people, or overwhelmingly black and poor, would you like to be independent? Answer, no. We want to be, we are proud to be Français. Thank you very much. Right? You went to Guadeloupe and asked what? Do you want to be independent? No, please, no. Don't even threaten us with a statement like that. The economies are so desperate that emigration, you understand, and the welfare system are essential for their survival. That's why in Puerto Rico, when Puerto Rico became independent, they couldn't get to New York or Chicago or whatever. They'd have to stand up in a line somewhere to be getting a visa. I mean, who knows what? They don't want that. So this is interesting. This is a part of the world where the former colonials don't wish to be independent. And the Dutch, the same thing. Curacao and Aruba. Don't mention the word. So finally, you see, the English took the initiative. They said, we are announcing your independence. Do you understand? Whether you like it or not, we are pulling out, bye-bye. We may have abused you. We may have been bad parents. We are leaving. And they did that mainly in the 1970s. By the way, the British started freeing their colonies in the early 60s. But they didn't get rid of the West Indies until the end of the 1970s because these islands kept saying, no, please, don't leave. And finally, at the end of the 1970s, they said to Grenada, you're on your own. There's still a few that pleaded so hard. There's Anguilla, for instance. They can't get rid of it. I mean, every time they even suggested it, that Anguilla, they start screaming and shouting and complaining. I mean, it's such a bizarre political situation. We want to be able to get to London. So now, the Dutch islands are still part of Holland. Holland has lost its empire. The only part of its empire that remains are Curacao and Aruba. The French still have their islands. The French Empire has what? Gone. The only part of the French Empire still surviving are Martinique and Guadeloupe, but they can't get rid of it. So the English islands are not independent. So how are they functioning? Well, they have a political party. Remember the unions? So now you have votes. So now the mulattoes or the Creoles are out, and now it's the blacks. The blacks are in, and in fact, whether it's the Bahamas, Dominica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Grenada, it doesn't make any difference. The blacks are in, and the political leaders all came out of the unions, right? And they say, redistribute the wealth. There's no wealth. There's nothing to redistribute. I mean, it's not like in New York. I mean, there's nothing to redistribute. The wealth left is the British government. So now, they thought. And they have to think. Because now I want to talk about a phenomenon. It's called the Great Migration. The first Great Migration in America was from Europe to America. People got in ships, and they came, and when they landed, they never asked about the weather. They ended up in places like North Dakota, Montana, do you understand? I mean, it was cold, freezing, whatever, and they still didn't ask about the weather. They simply wanted to make a living. They even ended up in Michigan in the winter. That's the first migration, not the first migration. The second migration is not part of the work culture, it's part of the leisure culture. In the leisure culture, weather is very good. So it's too cold. Well, it's too cold, the only direction to move is what? South. So now filling up and becoming the largest states in the Union are California, Arizona, New Mexico, and even Mississippi's growing. And Florida. There's so many people in Florida now, it's going back into the southern. They just fall into the water. I mean, fall into the water. So you move south. Well, now let me tell you about neighborhoods. First, the very rich moved to Florida. And then the next group of people. You want to live? Well, you can do that. You move to another neighborhood in Florida. You move up, or around, whatever else. It gets too crowded. You can't move in the expressways, the whole thing. So now, you say, well, where do I go? Very easy. Well, what's south of Florida? The Caribbean. But now maybe I've got myself a house on St. Martin's. Or a little one in Curacao, or maybe a little thing in Aruba, and certainly the government of these places will be friendly to people moving in with their money. You understand? That's where we're going to go. Just keep on moving south. But if you don't even want to move, you want to travel. So now there arrives this new industry, which has arrived in the Caribbean. Not conceived when the sugar industry failed. because it's part of the leisure culture. People didn't take vacations in the middle of the 19th century on the whole. They may have gone to a religious retreat. So, now, the vacation. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from North America and from Europe getting in boats and what? Going down to the islands. And now are there jobs? Well, yes! You can work in a hotel. You can be a bellhop. You can be a waiter. You can work in the kitchen. I mean, you can be a transporter. You can greet people at the airport. You can become a guide. I mean, there are all these things. Can tourism accommodate all of the population or most of it? It can accommodate a large part of it. Economies in all these places have picked up. They've picked up because they are now dealing with hordes of tourists getting off of ships, and they are there to serve them. And tourism is becoming a major industry in many parts of the world. I was in Bali twice. In high school, the major of kids, they don't go to college. The major of kids in high school is tourism. 80% of the students in Bali 9 80% of the students in Bali High are majoring in tourism. I couldn't believe it. Of course, what else are you going to major in? That's what this island, is the economy of the island good? Yes! Hotel after hotel after hotel after hotel. They don't have terrorists blowing things up. It's going to be great. So the future of these islands, is there going to be a substitute for sugar? Well, the only thing available is this thing which is now seizing humanity. I do want to tell you something. The amount of travel, like the consumption of sugar, there's something called travel addiction. I have it. A travel addiction is you can never get enough. You understand? You have to see this, you have to see that, you have to go here, you have to go there. It's part of the leisure culture. And in fact, instead of a sugar addiction, there is now a travel addiction. And in fact, these islands may be able to take advantage of it. Right now, most of the people are still in deep poverty. And the sign of it obviously was. Back in the early 80s, there was a rebellion on one of the English islands, Grenada, which was like a Cuban rebellion, encouraged by Castro. The tourist industry they couldn't believe what hit them. But that was taken care of very quickly because 1,900 troops were sent by Ronald Reagan, remember? They took care of Grenada, and now it's all back to what? It's all back to tourism because, I mean, you can't allow that to happen. It's terrible. Boats won't sail. So what's the implication of it all? Well, the implication of it all is these islands will continue to be very poor. The emigration to other places will continue. Tourism is going to what? Provide some basis for a new economy. And the last thing, this is my prediction, the whites will remain. Because in 30 or 40 years, the Caribbean is going to be one of the places where, if you want to move south, you will go. By then, Cuba will be freed of Castro, and Havana is going to be the great tourist capital of the Caribbean, and they're even going to go to Haiti, and they're going to move to St. Martin's and Dominica and St. Lucia. It's going to be the fashionable place to have what? A house. And was that the dream of the Black Power people in the 1920s? I don't think. Is that the future? Indeed, yes. And thank you very much.